I wanted to ask you about the scenario of the United States going to war with Iran from your military perspective, because we are seeing that the U.S.'s military intervention into Yemen is a complete failure. But at the same time, the threat is toward Iran, that they want to that they want to strike Iran, perhaps, and that is where this idea of maybe they're bluffing. But this has obviously been in the cards for some time, Colonel Wilkerson, whether it's a bluff now or not. So I'm curious, what would happen if the United States decided that it was going to do the unthinkable here?
I'm echoing Larry here, saying that I hope to heck this doesn't happen, but there is a possibility it will happen. But if it happens, I'll recite to you a conversation I had recently with a gentleman I re-met down in Williamsburg when I was talking to the League of Women Voters at their library down there. I'm at lunch with them afterwards, and about 14 of the League of Women Voters Council went to lunch. And I'm looking at the guy down on the far left facing me at the luncheon table. I know him. So when the lunch is over, I get up and walk over there. And sure enough, it's Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper. He was my boss when I was the Marine Corps War College director in the initial phases. He conducted a war game. This is long ago when Iran's capabilities were far less than they are now. And it didn't have Russia in a formal alliance, didn't have China more or less hovering over that alliance. He conducted a war game in which we lost badly trying to take on Iran. We lost so badly, and the war game gained such notoriety so fast that the authorities directed him to do it again. Now, he was in charge of what was then called the Marine Corps Education and Development Center. So he had responsibility for simulation and wargaming. So he did it again. We lost again. So I asked him at that luncheon, which was only about a month or so ago, I said, General, in your estimation, a very, very robust guy. He's a little older than I even, but he's in solid, good shape. Does PT every day. I said, what's your estimation now? He said, oh, we'd lose worse. I've been keeping up with it. I think he's right. I do think he's right. This is not a country, 90 million strong, extraordinarily homogeneous population, 52% Persian. And even the Baluchs and others who give them trouble from time to time would probably align with them in this interest. They would come together, they would hate our guts, and they would present us with an enormously difficult situation in terms of what we would ultimately have to do anything. And let's get beyond this airstrike business. That's not going to accomplish anything except making them unified and very angry. So we would have to invade. And we're talking about a country of, as I said, 90 million, fairly homogeneous, some of the roughest terrain in the world. It almost killed Alexander the Great when he bothered to come down there and sortie into their properties. Once was the greatest empire in the world, in my view, even greater than the Mughal or the Mongol or the later Eastern and Western Roman, any of the other empires. It was the greatest and most powerful empire in the world. And we're going to take them on in this sort of cavalier way that, as Pete Hegseth said, we're going to bring them back into the world of nations. They've been a nation, such as it is, a state, a whatever, for years longer than we have, at least 1,000 more than we have. And we're going to bring them back into the world. What ignorance of history, what crass, utter ignorance of history those statements personified. We're not going to bring them back into the world. They're going to bring us down if we do. And General Van Riper agreed with that assessment. I think it's a solid assessment. So I hope this is all poppycock aimed at getting ultimately the deal of the century for Donald Trump, because he lusts after a Nobel Peace Prize. And he better start making some peace if he wants a Nobel Peace Prize.
You know, there's been a response. The big bombshell now for Iran has been its response to Trump's threatening letter that was issued at the beginning of his administration, which said either you negotiate with us or you face military consequences, and you essentially accept Trump's terms, which are still very much in flux. But Iran has just responded to this after saying that they were not, the president, Pezeshkian,
Right.
he said we're not going to be bullied, but they just responded. And in the response, it was essentially, we're not going to have face-to-face necessarily. We're not going to reject talks. But what do you make of this in light of what Colonel Wilkerson was saying? Because what I'm seeing is that the United States militarily cannot defeat Ansarallah, which has hypersonic missiles itself, but does not have the weapons capabilities of Iran. And yet many people believe, Larry, that Iran is willing and ready to capitulate. I actually get these messages on the daily that many people think that Iran is capitulating. What do you make of all of this, all of these developments, given that people are very worried about the future of Iran under this threat?
Well, that's why I emphasize, let's look at the assumptions that people, pundits, politicians, military officials, intelligence analysts are making, because the assumptions are the key. And let's start with Yemen. If the Houthis had nothing but fixed military bases, fixed missile installations, all above ground, we'd be able to wipe them out. Not a problem, because they're fixed locations, they're well above ground, and we've got the weaponry that can take them out. But that's not Houthi land. Houthi land is that guy in the New York street corner that's doing 3-card Monte, or he's got the different shells and moving the pea around. That's what they're doing. They've got mobile missiles. They're constantly moving. And no matter how good we think our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities are, they are still woefully inadequate. I mean, I know firsthand from having watched just the efforts to try to track a ship underway in the ocean. We have trouble doing that. And we really have trouble being able to get a firm, fixed site on a particular location in the deserts of Yemen, where we can then launch either a cruise missile, a ballistic missile, or an airstrike to hit that location. Because guess what? By the time we get there, it may be gone. And it probably is gone. We ran into the same thing going after Scuds, 34 years ago in Iraq. We didn't get a one then. Now we may get one, but we're also ignoring the fact that the Yemenis, supposedly these crude, backward people, they've shot down, last count, 16 of these MQ-9 Predator drones, the Reapers. Those go for about $30 million, $31 million a pop. So just do the math on that. They've shot down almost $500 million worth of Predators. That's the Houthis. So you jump over to Iran. Iran has, and again, I'm stealing from my friend Larry here, because he said it earlier, but I'm going to take credit and sound smart. The Iranians have built shelters underground capable of withstanding all these bunker buster bombs, and they did so in part by learning lessons from the North Koreans who had preceded them in this. And Larry's correct to note about the terrain in Iran. And you're too young actually even to remember the first invasion of Iraq back in 2003. Were you even born back then? So, but we are incapable of going in and taking control of the entire area and knowing exactly what's there, and then being able to defeat it. We made that mistake in 2003, and now we're jumping ahead where Iraq at that time, when we were dealing with it, it's 1/4 the size of Iran. Okay? You look at how much difficulty we had controlling Iraq, go to Iran, multiply it times 4. Massive, a much larger landmass. So we're making lots of assumptions about Iran's weakness, about its fragility, about its brittleness that are, I think, based more on our hopes than in actual evidence.
Iran, in a few different instances now, especially as the narrative about going to war with Iran heats up. For example, earlier in the Trump administration and right before Trump actually began, there was a lot of talk by Israel of striking Iran's nuclear facilities, and how much they want to pressure Trump into doing that. And then Iran conducted military exercises and showed on video these massive underground tunnels replete with missiles. And they just did it again, actually, not too long ago, within the last several weeks. So could you talk about these capabilities then? Because it seems to me that the Trump administration, in making these threats, appears to be underestimating Iran's strength and its ability to defend itself. Why would it do that, given that he came in with a so-called peacemaker platform?
Well, I like to think it's because they are intent on negotiations and a new nuclear deal, which Trump can trumpet to the world and get his Nobel Peace Prize in line. They don't really do a study of the correlation of forces, as the old Soviets used to say, because the correlation of forces is not of interest to them. They don't do that kind of detail. I'm not even very confident that with CQ Brown gone and some of the other people who have on their own volition left the Pentagon, we don't talk about that very often, but a number of people have left the Pentagon on their own. They don't want to be around with raising Cain, for example, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or with what Hegseth purports to do. They simply don't want to be around. So I'm not sure they even realize that the circumstances have changed majorly in terms of the Iran, for example, that waged that brutal 8-year war with Iraq, on which both sides, we from time to time would appear, keeping it more or less a level playing field, if you will, and determining really that neither side would be a victor. My military analysis of that conflict, for example, tells me without equivocation that had we not balanced the scales, so to speak, constantly, Iran would have been in Baghdad in 4 years. As it was, they eviscerated Saddam's much more armor, mobile military, heavy with artillery, using chemical weapons all the time. Iran never resorted to chemical weapons, even though they had them used against them. Now, they did use so-called human wave attacks and things like that, but that's what I'm talking about with regard to this homogeneity of the population and so forth. You get a lot of people who'd be willing to do that sort of thing, but they've moved well beyond that now. They have much better capability than that. But the bottom line is they'd have been in Baghdad very shortly, and we'd have been standing there holding our finger because the Shah was gone. Iran was now the hegemon in the Gulf, and Riyadh would have been shivering in its boots and begging us to come along because they would have invested Baghdad and they would invest Iraq right after that. So we discount this power to our own discredit, and we don't study the history to our own discredit. Let's look at Ukraine and Russia. Look at Witkoff, whom I think is a mild-mannered man who actually talks like a diplomat, but he's really a real estate agent, and he hasn't done the history on Russia. He is so dead wrong about Russia that it makes my heart hurt when I think about it. Putin will eat him up, has eaten him up, in effect, because Putin is doing what he wants to do, when he wants to do it, and how he wants to do it. And, you know, the ceasefire and other things that we've talked about so much and that Trump made a real issue about when he first took power aren't happening in terms of peace. So I'm not confident at all that this administration, come to the bottom line, knows what it's doing with Iran, with Gaza, with the Levant in general, with Ukraine. It doesn't know what it's doing. And the signals imbroglio, however it is parsed out to be, you know, I think it's a conspiracy, actually. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think they're trying to get rid of Trump, and they've started the process. Certain people within the administration who have neoconservative tinges about them are trying to get rid of Trump and Hegseth and all the rest of them. So it's not a promising field. Anywhere is it a promising field. And probably the least promising is in Southwest Asia.
Yeah, and Trump certainly, in these early moves, laying a pathway to getting rid of himself when, in the case of what the consequences of a war with Iran would be for just his administration, let alone humanity as a whole. But Larry, I wanted to,
Danny, let me say one other thing there. I don't want
yeah,
to interrupt, but
sure,
my fear here, just as my fear was with Ukraine, and that hadn't gone away completely, my fear here is that when the American people sense 10,000 casualties in a day, when they get exposed to that, we haven't done war for a long time.
Yeah.
The Americans alive today have never done war. Not really. Not really. They've never had bombs dropped on them or anything. They've never had the New York Times with 10,000 casualties on one page. That's what we're going to have. And we'll go nuclear.
for all of what's going on now in West Asia, of course, all of this centers on Gaza, Palestine, what's been going on, especially over the last 16 plus months. Now, the Trump administration has dove right in, going for the big enchilada, going for Iran, but essentially green lighting this disaster all across West Asia that Israel is, of course, embarking on and waging, and the United States is completely, fully supporting and facilitating. In large part, it seems the administration is so deeply committed to Israel that it is walking along this very thin tightrope, and is risking falling off into a cataclysmic war, which it's getting into a deeper quagmire in Yemen, while it is moving toward Iran, all in part because there is this Israel. I know, Carl Wilkerson, you have your thoughts on this too. So first to you, Larry, about the role of Israel here. And
Well, the hopes I held out 2 months ago that Donald Trump was embarking on a new path of where he was genuinely going to try to create the foundation for a real peace agreement in the region and not be held hostage by the Zionists. I've come to understand that I was wrong, that he is absolutely fully captured by Bibi Netanyahu, by the Zionist cabal, by American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. And instead of creating the foundation for a genuine peace agreement, he is now facilitating and enabling Israel's genocide. The problem is Israel. And, Israel is a hot mess. Bibi Netanyahu is facing growing internal divisions. You've got, this army is dependent upon reservists, and they have to be, called from their regular jobs and go into the military service. They're starting to rebel. They're not showing up. They're being called to report, and they're not showing up. And so you've got questions about Israel's actual military strength, about its manpower, at the very time where the demands on the Israeli army have expanded, not diminished. Because now they're talking about renewing ground operations in Gaza. They're carrying out ground operations in the West Bank. They've got ground forces in Syria. They've got ground forces in Lebanon or immediately along the border carrying out operations. Israel doesn't have vast resources that it can devote to all of these different missions. And normally you'd have to pick and choose. Right now they're not picking and choosing. And that what happens is they end up stretching themselves to a breaking point. On top of that, you've got Bibi at war with sort of the traditional, I'll call them non-Zionist members of the Israeli establishment. He has fired the head of Shin Bet. He has fired the attorney general. So he is at a time of war. The last thing you want to be is at war with yourself internally, which is exactly what we're seeing. So as opposed to Israel being this very reliable, solid ally that we can count on, they're a wild card. And Netanyahu is, he's acting not in the interest of Israel. He's acting to save his own rear end, which faces significant legal risks and prosecutions. So the United States is being played. And unfortunately, when we have voices like Mike Huckabee and others, and even Pete Hegseth, who are quoting this religious Zionist nonsense. Oh, God gave this land to them, and this is the fulfillment of prophecy. And oh my God, we need to go with it. We end up buying into a lie, buying into some assumptions, acting on those assumptions, and then we have to pay the consequences for our foolish beliefs.
Right now it's slaughtering people in Gaza. The United States is, the Palestinians in Gaza, the United States is completely on board with that. But it is in this multi-front quagmire that it is building up toward. And the big target is Iran.
It reminds me somewhat of the historical period in which the Israelites, if you will, were a little enclave empire in between some real giants of empires. And they had a prophet by the name of Jeremiah who kept telling them over and over again that they were overextending themselves, that they had forgotten the Torah, forgotten the true way, forgotten God even, were worshiping the golden calf, so to speak, which is usually associated with Moses coming down from the mountain and finding them all in this sort of mode. But they periodically went into this sort of mode, and Jeremiah was warning them. And then finally, of course, Nebuchadnezzar had had enough and came out of Babylon and destroyed them. And those whom he didn't kill, he took into slavery for a long period of time into the future. And I think we're at a moment like that again for the Israelites of the present day. And I think it's going to happen. I'm wondering in my own mind what the United States is going to do when Israel as a state completely collapses. Is the United States going to put forces on the ground in the Levant in order to save Israel's ass? And in that case, what are they saving them for? Because they will have, in fact, committed suicide. They will have, under his aegis, under Bibi's aegis, they will have destroyed their democracy. They had already pretty much done that anyway. It was fair to call them an apartheid state, not a democracy, certainly not a liberal democracy. He will have waged war on their judiciary and destroyed that. He will have waged war on every other aspect of Israel's government that might have opposed him. He will have destroyed that. The Knesset will be his. He owns the Knesset. They're all his people. He's now restored, and this was his latest move, to stave off the budget battle that would have cost him an election, a mandatory election, and he would have been defeated. He staved that off by bringing Ben-Gvir and Smotrich back into his coalition, and at the last minute getting all of those problems solved, apparently. And he's destroying his IDF, the last bastion of external, if you will, protection for Israel. Takes me back to when a BBC reporter asked Golda Meir in 1973, I think it was, would she, if Israel were in an existential situation, invoke the Samson option? Would she use a nuclear weapon, and insinuating use it on top of Israel to kill all of its enemies around it? And she said, without doubt. She essentially said, without doubt. That's in the record. That's on the BBC. She said it on the BBC. It was reported by this particular journalist for the BBC. That scares me too. We're in a position where if that were to be a possibility, and even if it weren't to turn nuclear in the Samson option, would the United States, when Israel begins to fold in on itself as a destroyed state with perhaps 5 or 6 Arab armies closing in on it, would we go there? Would we go there, and would we try to reverse that situation? That's a hell of a question, really, if you think about it. And it's one that is coming into possibility more and more every day, as long as this genocide continues. At the same time, we would do it with not a single ally in the world, not even Japan or Korea. They would not support our doing something like that. They might not say anything at the time. I suspect most of them would, but they would not support us ultimately in that action. So we would be bereft of allies, bereft of friends. Maybe we would have 1 or 2 in Europe who happen to be Nazis themselves, But that's it. This is a very, very painful scenario for me to contemplate, and that it might happen in my short years remaining is even more painful, because I'm watching the American empire destroy itself before my eyes.